Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Digital Front Door. I'm Scott Benedict. Today, we're going to dive into one of the most exciting developments in the world of retail media, the rise of the in-store digital advertising. One of the things I've noticed is that as retailers and brands alike push to monetize their physical spaces, in-store retail media networks are emerging as kind of the next chapter, if you will, or major frontier in the evolution of the unified commerce experience and the way marketers go about promoting products and retail businesses themselves. Joining me today is Kevin Bridgewater. Kevin is the Senior Vice President of Retail Solutions at Quad, and Quad is a company that is involved in leading this transformation with its in-store Connect platform. Kevin and his team are bringing digital engagement to where 92% of grocery sales still happen, and that's inside store aisles. And Kevin, welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Scott, it's great to be here. Appreciate you having me and looking forward to the conversation.
As am I. Why don't we kind of start the conversation with the big picture? Retail media has certainly exploded in the last few years, but most of that has been online. And now we're seeing a lot of retailers as well as a lot of brands thinking more seriously about how retail media comes to life in a physical store. I'm kind of curious from your perspective, what's driving that expansion of in-store retail media focus and some of that activity?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It's a great question to kind of start the conversation. You and I both have backgrounds in retail, and I think we grew up in an industry that you largely can generate profit in two different ways. You can either make it through the buy of the product from the brand via your negotiations, or you make it to the sell of the product. And for years, that has been, where most of the focus from merchants and key retailers existed. Retail media changed all that. And I think retail media has now opened up an opportunity. I presented to a group of leaders in our organization a few months ago, and somebody asked me the questions like, how can a retailer make money on delivering a box of $2.99 coffee filters to my door and not charge me a delivery fee? And I thought for a moment, I'm like, here's how they can do that. Because they made their money on the e-commerce journey via the retail media on how you purchased that product to get it to your front door. And that kind of just gives you a good view of how retail media has changed retail. I mean, I've been either in it or supporting it for about 30 years now, and I think it's the most dramatic change that I've personally seen. So then, okay, what do you have to do to get there? And I think this, obviously some of the larger retail organizations have figured it out very well. But I think we're in this stage, where does that mid-market retail kind of, where do they sit in this? Where do they sit in their ability to maximize what retail media can bring? And we are certainly in the infancy stages of that. But while developing an on-site and off-site strategy is important regardless of the size, your audience size that you have for some of these retailers simply isn't large enough to generate the revenue that is going to make a brand excited. That changes within store. You referenced where 92% of the grocery purchases are still made. That's where the audience size really comes into play here. And at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to help retailers do, is fully maximize the audience that they have coming in their stores on a daily basis.
And that makes total sense. And so when we define in-store media to those maybe who aren't from our industry, it's not traditional signage. It's maybe not some of the ways that we think about in-store media previously. It's got some digital elements. So if someone asks you to define what does in-store retail media really entail, what's the first things that come to mind from your perspective?
Yeah, I think the biggest shift, I mean, you're right. There are brands have been promoting in store for a long time now. The key difference is the power of digital content. So going from traditional static content of a floor graphic or something else to dynamic graphic motion video in a subtle but powerful way inside the environment. We all know how we all got a little bit of a marketer in us, and we all know how we navigate a store when we're in there and we kind of peek down an aisle. Do we need to go down that aisle or not? Knowing that you can attract a shopper down that aisle through content is one of the bigger advantages of what digital in-store retail media can do. Then you get into, okay, what's the depth of the CMS? Fortunately with our product, we can daypart. We can do as many different things as we want. We can serve content screen specific, daypart specific. And by doing that, you're kind of meeting that shopper where we think he or she is at that particular moment in their journey of what they're looking for. And I think that's a big change of what we would have said as traditional static or printed in-store media to what digital has brought. I told people that the store has kind of been the last frontier of digitization. And, we're here. We're at that point now.
Yeah, and it makes sense. And one of the things that I found compelling and made me want to have you join us is I was reading a little bit about Quad's in-store connect program, and it really caught my attention when I read some of the case studies with some of your clients, Save Mart, and some other retailers. Can you maybe walk us through, for anybody that doesn't have one of your clients in their market, what is this new model? What is unique about it? And how do you integrate maybe some of the creative elements with data and media to kind of make this a very compelling in-store platform or in-store media type?
Yeah. So let me start kind of a little bit about the relationship between the retailer and the CPG. We did a project for one of our large retail clients on the amount of things a retailer is asking a brand to support on their behalf. Through that due diligence of that project, we found that on average, there's over 30 different programs throughout the course of a fiscal year that the retailer is asking a CPG to support. And when I say support, it largely comes in the form of some sort of a fund, local trade, regional shopper, brand, whatever it is. And what was missing out of those asks, and I think it kind of led to there's just a little bit of tiredness from the CPGs here, is that there were a lot of these asks that weren't driving more cases for the brands. And you and I both know that if we want to get a brand excited about participating in anything, ultimately it comes down to case movement. And so as we're building this program, we wanted to make sure that we had two fundamental disciplines. We wanted to be in the environment. We wanted to be, like, when I say in the environment, like within the shopping part of the store. We didn't want to be purely at the exit. We didn't want to be in certain areas, and we wanted it to be just endemic content. I think the industry does have a little bit of confusion of what's digital communication in a store versus what's true in-store retail media. Digital communication in a store is fine if that's something a retailer feels they need. If you want to support local events through a digital signage program, that's great. That is not in-store retail media. In-store retail media is providing a CPG an opportunity to engage with a shopper in that moment of truth of purchase. And you need to be in the environment where those products can be put into the basket. And so that's been probably the biggest thing that we've had to stay disciplined on. And then, fortunately, as I was referencing earlier, the numbness of the brands getting hit up for additional support, none of this goes away when you can provide significant lift. And, the case studies we've been able to do, and I know we shared those with you, we're getting significant lift, both with just equity promotions and obviously promotions that's got an offer built into it. And I think that's what's going to accelerate in-store retail media at a very rapid rate.
Yeah. And one of the things you mentioned, and I've noticed this as well, is that a lot of focus, perhaps rightfully, has been on advertiser spending on the largest retailers' platforms, at Kroger and at Walmart. And obviously that makes sense because from a media buying and engagement standpoint, that's a pretty big footprint. But I think any of us who knows anything about grocery retail is there's a number of regional players that, even though they may not make the top 10 lists when you're looking at the context of national grocery retail, they're still incredibly powerful in the regions in which they play, and they need ways to really not only engage in a way that the advertiser or the brand feels compelled, but also be able to offer this great in-store experience that is in some cases digitally enabled to their shoppers, just like someone with a national footprint. And so, that opens up part of my perception of what it is that you and the Quad team do is you open up some opportunities to maybe smaller regional mid-market players that may not have the scale of a Walmart or a Kroger. And I'm just curious, one, am I thinking about that right? And what are some of the things that you do to kind of help some of your clients unlock that opportunity, even if they aren't the largest in their space?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think we're seeing this term modern retail around. It's kind of like it's kind of like value. It's starting to get overused a little bit. But I think one of the first things we counsel our retail clients on is, you need to get into modern retail. But let's define what modern retail means to you. Let's not define what modern retail means to somebody else that you're trying to duplicate. Because, a mid-market retail grocer is not going to have 4 million SKUs, available like Walmart does. A mid-market retailer is not going to, quote, become a media channel like some of these other big platforms are. So I think that's the first thing we do is let's level set what you can be successful at here, and all the while keeping your shopper as the North Star. And anytime you're trying to help a mid-market grocer, a mid-market retailer kind of advance, you got to remove the barriers. They're fighting every day. You got to remove the barriers from IT, you got to remove the barriers from operations, you got to remove the barriers from merchants. So as we developed our program, we're going in and we're covering the CapEx, which is critical. We're installing these screens. We're doing this in the form of a rev share. We have an infrastructure to help them sell to brands on their behalf to generate that. And our infrastructure sits completely outside of the firewall of the organization. So those three, again, when we were doing our due diligence, what's the easiest path to entry here? And as a former retailer, I'm like, okay, the CFO is getting hit up every day with CapEx requests. The ops team is getting hit up with, so we had to remove barriers we knew we were going to face. And we put a lot of thought into that. And the other is, we're not trying to turn these stores into a disruptive digital environment. We want to make sure that aesthetically the hardware fits seamlessly into the environment. And again, you heard me mention our focus only on endemic content. We wanted to make sure there was a value there to that shopper. If the shopper is going to engage, and we want them to engage, there needs to be that immediate return of value. And that could, when I see immediate return, ideally, yes, in those extra items in the basket, but more so creating that connection between the shopper and the retailer that this particular store has my best interests in mind. They're treating me and greeting me with information that's helpful for how I support my family, how I get through my weekly food budget, which we know is a challenge for a lot of people in our country.
Indeed. And it's interesting you kind of reference that, because from a shopper experience standpoint, placing, potentially new digital screens or digital touch points at the point of decision, in an aisle, on an end cap, at the entrance to a store, perhaps. How do you and how does the team think about this balance between engagement with overstimulation, or making too much going on in the in-store experience, and through that, kind of how do you, the team, think about how do you do in-store right? How do you strike that right balance between engaging the customer and providing the value to the advertiser while still making a pleasant and hopefully informative experience for the shopper?
Yeah, again, another great question. We spend a lot of time. Again, I'm in a grocery store 3 or 4 times a week. I love to shop. Maybe it makes me crazy. It probably makes you and I both crazy for being in this business. But we've done some research on this. There are moments and there's variables that are very tight of when the shopper is heads down versus when they're heads up. And it's those two things are very critical when it comes to how we engage with a shopper and where we make our recommendations on screen location. You mentioned the entryway. We don't put our screens in the vestibule area of a store. Our view is the shopper, they're still putting their kids in the cart. They're still putting their keys away. They haven't become in search mode. We view the store, when it comes to in-store retail media, it's kind of like a search engine. Where's that shopper heads up? Where are they looking for information? Where are they looking for inspiration on what to put in their basket? That's where we want to meet them. And sometimes that's the difference of not being in the entryway, but being within the first 10 to 15 feet of the racetrack. And again, we're very prescriptive on what that looks like, because again, there's an outlay here of CapEx. There's an investment from the brands, and all that is dependent for success on the shopper engaging. So we have to make sure we have those things in mind. And while we're certainly open to long-term branding impact, and I think in-store media does open up. Quad has a large paid media service, and we're a paid media agency for a lot of our retailers. So much effort of paid media is to get people to the store. That's where the investment has largely been historically. And it's like, once you get them to the store, it's kind of up to the ops team to make sure they're happy in the visit. Now, in-store retail media opens up a completely new funnel, and that funnel is very traditional in store as well. There's top of funnel awareness, there's that mid funnel conversion, all the way down to that final component of getting an item into the basket. The difference is, I think this is probably a different conversation down the road, but the way agencies or brands buy has typically been towards the first part of it. It's about just getting a visit, getting a trip to a store. They're buying metrics, or they're buying click-throughs. They're buying a lot of things that ultimately aren't related to another item go in the basket. And I think there's a fundamental change of how brands have to buy in-store retail media, because I personally think it's the most precise form of media that can be purchased. When you can promote your brand in a store where that shopper can immediately put that item in the basket, there is nothing more precise than that. The challenge is there is no closed loop attribution to it. There's no engagement. You can scan a QR code or a flow code. You can do a few other things, but it doesn't have the typical attribution components that an e-commerce experience does. And that's just going to be a discipline and a learning that all of us go through as how brands start to buy in-store retail media.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that was where I was going to go with my next question, which is this concept of data and measurement, and the challenge that has historically posed for in-store media is how do you know what activity led to what sale on what day, so that you can continue to refine it. And if you're the advertiser, that you can feel like your spend is driving towards an outcome that you might not have gotten another way. And so my understanding and some of the things that I've read and about what Quad does is that in some cases, retailers will share transaction log data with your advertisers to kind of track the impact of in-store digital ads. How do you do that? What, I guess maybe the context is what will retailers share or not share, and how do you use that in partnership with the brands that advertise with you in a way that's safe, secure, but also tries to drive the best ROI, the best outcome, so that a brand knows that I spent X dollars and it resulted in X sales as a result? How do you manage through that in a modern context?
Yeah, the infancy stages of in-store retail media are going to require more performance recaps from the brands, because we're still tapping. When you go to any large CPG right now and you say, show me a pie of how your annual marketing spend budget is, you're not going to see a piece of that pie for in-store retail media. The industry just hasn't matured yet. We'll get there. So now we're tapping into test budgets, we're tapping into innovation budgets, or we're asking them to increase local trade, we're asking them to increase regional shopper. When you make those asks, somebody at that brand is they're going out on a limb for you. And in order to validate them doing that, we've got to make sure we provide those metrics back. We do require getting T-log data back from our retail partners, and they're completely supportive, and we do it in a purely non-identifiable way. We're just looking for the transaction. When we get loyalty data, it's by a loyalty number, not an individual. So we're staying well above data privacy concerns. But what it does, two things. We're always going up against a group of control stores that we're measuring against. The first thing it does, it allows us to measure sales lift. That's the most important thing. We were talking earlier that if brands are going to continue to invest, that numbness to this continued ask has to come with performance. And, again, in-store retail media in general is changing the landscape of how retailers and brands coexist together. But that T-log data allows us to get just that initial lift over a group of control stores. What it also does, though, and I think this is just the advancement of where the industry is going, it allows us to look in new to category. So when we get that loyalty ID, we can say, okay, this shopper bought Ritz crackers while we were promoting a Ritz in the store, and bought Ritz crackers in the last 12 months. So there's a new to category. Or they were new to brand. Maybe they were buying in the cracker category, but they hadn't bought Ritz crackers. So those are the type of things that are really exciting to the CPG that are making these investments. And fortunately, we're able to do that. That's part of our solution as well. We offer all these metrics back in return for the investment that we're getting from the CPGs.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. And, you've mentioned that there are quantifiable lifts that happen that getting at this data allows you to articulate back to clients and to the retailer to show that because you base it off of control stores. And I'm curious, what do you think drives those results in a way that drives both brand equity and conversion? In other words, is it the relevance of other things the consumer shopped, the fact that they're in that particular location in the store? I assume that there's no personalization data at this stage of in-store media that's driving relevancy of someone who likes this tends to like that. But kind of what do you think's driving some of the benefits in ROI other than just an awareness that this item is on this aisle or is in this location?
I define retail kind of in two different types. There's purpose-driven retail and there's need-driven retail. Purpose driven. When I go to my local hardware store and I need a screw to fix something in my garage, I'm going to walk out of there with that screw. I'm not going to walk out of there with that screw and 10 other items. You know, compare that to grocery, food, drug, mass. It is a need driven, ongoing trip. So while I'm going to the grocery with a few specific needs that are purpose driven, I know I have needs that go beyond what was quote on my list. And I think that's part of, the evolution of the shopper. 10 plus years ago, we were all trying to get shoppers to be head down, work with your phone, build your list, work, shop within the app while you're going. And I think we've learned from that while that's something, every retailer needs a very good, engaging app. Once you get them to the store, you want that shopper to be heads up. You want them to see the beauty of your store, especially in the perishable. You want them to sense the environment that they're in. And when we do that, again, just this, as marketers, we've all got a little bit of marketer in us. We have to believe in the power of dynamic content. I think what is the one thing that can really, and I know we've sent you a little bit, but when you can see how this content just serves as inspiration to that shopper, like, I didn't come here for that, but you know what? I do have a need for that. And I think that's the power, any type of media, at the end of the day is actually dependent on how good the content is and how good the content can relate to that shopper. And in-store retail media is opening up a whole new opportunity to have really great content in front of the shopper.
It's interesting because I grew up in the consumer electronics part of retailing, and we were always taught this concept of solution selling. In other words, if someone came in to buy a big ticket item, what were all the other items around it that they also needed to provide a solution? And in grocery, it's always seemed to me that the best grocers who anticipate a need, or what my friends in the software industry call a need state, and it feels like this is where retail media can really have an impact. We obviously see a key drive periods where stores will merchandise products together that are maybe from different categories, but they're all part of preparing the holiday meal, or having an event around the launch of football season, or something like that. Does it feel like retail media in store, as it continues to improve, can maybe start to go beyond selling the item to selling a little bit more of the solution based on either things that are known or inferred? What day of the week it is, what day part it is, what part of the store that you're in. Does it feel like there's opportunities to kind of continue to refine that as we go forward?
Yeah, it does. I mean, in the grocery business, there's ability to sell product every day, but you have these key selling opportunities. And I'll just use an example of a brand that we're strategizing with right now. Pepsi is a big sponsor of the Super Bowl every year. The 10 days leading up to the Super Bowl, for Pepsi, to be honest, it's much more important than just a random 10 days throughout a different time of year. So for you to be able to go in and change much just for those 10 days in traditional marketing in the store is really, really difficult to execute. But when you have the ability to do it digitally, you can bring to life so many other activations of a greater investment that Pepsi in this case is making around the Super Bowl. And again, you can do this, you can make that example throughout, a lot of different times of the year. And again, I think that's where you're going to see a lot of brands start to take full advantage. How do we activate larger investments through this type of content now in a store environment?
That makes it makes a lot of sense. And I love to see it because of the fact that I know in many cases consumers, yes, they are shopping for a particular item that they know they need, but the real opportunity broadly as a retailer, and certainly within store media specifically, is to share with them perhaps a product they didn't know that they needed, or something that provides a solution to something that they were trying to solve for during their shopping trip. Oh, yes, I need that item, or I forgot to put that on my list. Thank goodness I was prompted by an in-store ad to add that to my box, right?
It saved them another trip on a forgotten item potentially, which at that point you're doing the shopper a service. Totally agree. Yeah,
Indeed. So if we were to get together again a year from now, I'm going to ask you to try and look forward into this next year, into 2026. Where do you think in-store retail media evolves? And if we sat down a year from now, what do you think we'd say about what transpires during the course of 2026 in this space? What changes do you see that are just in the offing?
Yeah, there's a lot there.
That was supposed to be an easy question. Sorry.
No, I think there's a lot of things happening. I think the realization that the traditional buckets of where funding exists from CPGs to support retailers, those buckets are being disrupted heavily, and probably need even more disruption. And I think it's just, when we see stats from McKinsey and others that there was $55 billion spent in retail media last year, and it's projected to be $100 billion by 2028. There is this naiveness that this is new revenue from the brands. Now, there's certainly some of that's new, but I don't think anybody is going to nod our heads and believe that the CPGs came up with $55 billion of new spend. That's not reality. What they've done is there's been a slow migration from some of these traditional buckets of funding into the larger platforms. I think that has been how the growth has occurred to the extent that we see it in retail media. Now, what that means is probably, okay, maybe retailer A lost 2% of their local trade and they saw 2% of their regional shopper budget get disrupted. And they're like, well, I can live with that. But over time, that disruption is going to continue to occur unless this mid-market retail category gives brands a reason to not pull those funds. And the best way you can give them is to have something that they know they can get incremental case movement out of. Because we know the pressure that the larger retailers are putting on these brands to invest more into their retail media platforms. That's the $55 billion that I referenced comes from the pressure to continue to invest. They have the leverage to do that. We would do the exact same thing. So to stop kind of where that migration away, I think CPGs and retailers, in-store retail media needs to be part of their joint business planning conversations. It just needs to be. I truly believe that CPGs want to continue to have a very strong market share in mid-market retail. They don't want all their products sold off of a couple of platforms, so from a couple of retailers. They want the diversity in every type of retail channel that exists. But at the same time, you got to give them a reason to invest with you. And I think those are conversations that have to shift and start to get a little more strategic between the retailer and the CPG. I think that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is just, educating, the buying industry of media on, what is the key measurement for in-store retail media versus other metrics on other type of media that's being bought, and building that awareness. It's not easy to buy in-store retail media, whether it's from Quad or others right now. I think as an industry, we got to simplify that a little bit. We got to educate the brands on how to buy, why to buy, and then the results of the buy when they get them.
That is a kind of a fascinating place to leave off this conversation, because it is a rapidly evolving and changing part of the industry. And it's pretty clear that retail media is no longer something that's confined to the digital shelf. And that's really the purpose behind us getting together, is to talk about how it's coming to the physical shelf as well, and extending the real world experience in really meaningful and measurable ways for advertisers as well as for consumers and for the retailers. So it's been exciting to share that. I really appreciate, Kevin, you kind of sharing your thoughts and your perspectives.
It's been my pleasure, Scott. I really appreciate you having me on.
You bet. So for brands or for retailers wanting to learn a little bit more about Quad and their In-Store Connect platform, we'll put a slide up on the screen that provides you both a website and an email contact for the team at Quad if you'd like to talk to Kevin and the team about learning and build a little bit more. And so thanks again to Kevin, and thanks to our listeners for joining us and for tuning into this episode of The Digital Front Door. I'm Scott Benedict. Thanks for listening.